Hello, good evening, everyone, or good morning to you, Sanjeev. Also, some colleagues from Europe. Good afternoon, perhaps. I would like to ask the participants their mics and also the camera, perhaps, to have some efficient connection. So thank you again for participating in the Sleva webinar. So today we will discuss the topic, which is one of the burning issues now in evaluations. No one left behind into the evaluation criteria. This one is a lesson from the pandemic. So for the today's speaker will be Sanjeev Shridharan. I will introduce his profile later. But before we start, I would like to thanks everyone here. First of all is to Asela, the president of Sri Lanka Evaluation Association, the host of this webinar, and also to our colleague from the Indonesian Development Evaluation Community. Some board members are here. Thank you. And also from the evaluation community of India, Rasmi is here, and I also see other colleague here. And EvalYouth, Erika, and then Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, and also the FRC. Thank you again. I would like to start with introduce myself. My name is Umi Hanik. I'm the co-founder of the Indonesian Development Evaluation Community, also the founder of Monef Studio. So Monef Studio is basically a startup to promote sustainable development and evaluation literacy in Indonesia. And before I start this startup, I also the former of the board of directors and also acting secretary of Asia Pacific Evaluation Association. So I was there with Saman Bandara. And then professionally, I was an evaluation professional. So it's been 18 years now in development evaluations. So next, we will have an opening remarks from my colleague, Rasmi Agrawal. So Rasmi is basically a founding member and core group member of the evaluation community of India. She's also a former director from the government of India and more than 20 years of experience in M&E. She is now more enjoying the independent as the M&E independent consultant, and nowadays she's the board. Formerly, she's the fourth board member of the IDES, the International Development Evaluation Association, and also the steering committee of the Community of Evaluation of South Asia. Rasmi hosted a great conference in February, the EvalFest in New Delhi. It was very great. We have we signed a memorandum of understanding to advance learning in evaluation between Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India. It was a great initiative in the regions. Now, Rasmi, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Umi. And hi all. Today we are having a webinar on a very important topic, that is integrating no one left behind principle in evaluation criteria. For this topic, we have an excellent speaker, Sanjeev Shridharan. While adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the world community made a pledge to ensure no one will be left behind and to endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. In practice, this means taking explicit action to end extreme poverty, curb inequality, confront discrimination, and fast-track progress for the furthest behind. Now, we have been in the SDG world for about 5 years now, making some progress towards the goals. not perhaps at the desired pace in all the goals basically, and maybe at varying pace in some goals like poverty and gender equality. Then unfortunately, this COVID-19 arrived and upset the entire process. In the last 3 months, several industrial and service units have been closed, several decent jobs and self-employment opportunities have been lost. The workers in the unorganized sector are the worst hit. People will not doubt pick up threads and in due course get back to their feet, but it may take a long time, a slow and painful process. What does this imply for NOLD principle? Before COVID, people who had been earlier left behind were trying to move ahead, ever so slightly, but in the aftermath of pandemic, not only they have been pushed back a long distance, but those who were slightly ahead and had a modicum of decent employment and incomes and were trying to forge ahead using the opportunities they had have also been pushed back by a large margin. Loss of learning opportunities for those who have no access to net and are affected now and in future also. It will take a long time that things will come in the mainstream. It's high time that we integrate NOLB principles in evaluation criteria so that it could get a focus in all the evaluations we do. I'm sure you are all eagerly awaiting to listen Sanjeev, the country lead learning systems and systems evaluation at the India office of Melinda and Gates Foundation, present his views on how to get back to development evaluation and how to integrate the NOLD principle so that it could have a focus. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to give the opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rasmi. It was a great speech. And now I would like to introduce our main speaker, Sanjeev Shridharan. So Sanjeev Shridharan is a country-led learning system and system evaluation at the India country office of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. He was the founding director of Evaluation Center for Complex Health Interventions at St. Michael Hospital and associate professor at the Institute for Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. So prior to his position at Toronto, he was also the head of the evaluation program and senior research fellow at the research unit in health, behavior and change at the University of Edinburgh. He is a former associate editor of the American Journal of Evaluation and has been on the board of the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluations, New Direction for Evaluation, and the Journal of Evaluation and Program Planning. So Sanjeev will provide an overview of the conclusion from the nearly 2 years process to adapt and revise the definitions of the widely used evaluation criteria, which is first set out by the OECD Development Assistance Committee in 1991. And he will share the new definition, including the new criteria, coherence, and what motivated the change. So Sanjeev will also reflect and explore how the leave no one behind consideration into the evaluation criteria are reflecting the lesson from the current pandemic. Well, I think I see a lot of excitement from participants here, because we in Indonesia is also discuss a lot of this. So please feel free to write your question in the chat box for all of participants coming or join this discussion, and we will pick later the first come first questions. We'll get a response first. And now, Sanjeev, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, yes.
Fantastic. Oh, no, I'm so delighted. I'm so delighted to, I see a number of friends. I won't embarrass anybody by calling them out. It's great to rejoin this conversation. And it's a conversation that when I began coming back to South Asia, it was Sleva that was my main home. So I can see a number of names here. It's quite lovely to rejoin this, I think, fairly important conversation around the Sustainable Development Goals, this whole business of evaluation criteria. Almost a decade ago, Fred Carden, Catherine Hay, I, and a number of others, we engaged in some very exciting evaluation capacity building work in Sri Lanka and all of South Asia. And I do think that in some sense, in a rather weird way, the pandemic really provides an opportunity to restart some of the conversations. I'm going to make 3 points, really. One is I'm going to bring a focus on the evaluation criteria. And my point of view is I'm not terribly enamored, just to cut to the chase. It's important we don't become mechanical about it. And I think it's important that the conversation on taking a leadership position on how we use such criteria needs to come from the global south. That's partly why I'm delighted to I made some of these original comments in Egypt a few months ago, and glad to do it in Sri Lanka today, and Sri Lanka, Indonesia, other places too. That's one. A second comment that I'm a little surprised by is when you listen to discussions around evaluation criteria, and then you go listen to the Sustainable Development Goals, and some of its discussion around no one left behind, I see a disconnect. And I think it's important, if we are serious about it, that we make those connections in a direct kind of way. But most importantly, I think it's vital that we move away from just sort of talking about criteria and demonstrating that how to use it in real applications, etc. Those are my 3 points. So the basic discussion will be, first, I'll just talk a little bit about the introduction to the criteria, a little bit about no one left behind, 2 stories. Actually, I had a bunch of stories that I lined up over the weekend, but I realized I had time for 2. But then I want to make the connections to the pandemic, and I really do think that the pandemic it's a rather extraordinary time, and I'm really interested in the kinds of, I've been engaged in a discussion with a number of friends around what does it mean for the evaluation community. And finally, I think the idea for me is not whether we need, I just want to stress this, I'm not fussed about making a plea for another criteria, I don't really care. The bigger issue is how do we reimagine its use in a real sense itself too, and how do we connect no one left behind. Sense with the little bit about the folk efficiency, these terms right now, that real serious influence. If you look at documents by different governments, evaluation documents, you'll see these 5 criteria showing up in some form or the other. What was timely was around in between 2018 to 2019. OECD and a number of international partners went through a process of asking, how should this be revised? And they came up with essentially, in my view, a reasonably conservative strategy, where they held on to the original 5 and they added coherence, a criteria I absolutely am delighted to see included. But just to get a little bit of referencing, relevance is the intervention doing the right thing. Effectiveness is the intervention achieving its objectives. Impacts, which we tend to reify, for understandable reasons, what difference is the intervention making? Efficiency, how well are the resources being used? Sustainability, that I am very enamored of, and I think a big hole in evaluation is serious thinking around sustainability. Will the benefits last? I think most of our designs don't allow us to answer that question. But here comes the big one, as far as I'm concerned. How well does the intervention fit? Coherence. And in the last week or 2, I've been looking for different examples of good examples of coherence. I have not found many. But this is not about good examples or not. It's about actually sort of striking an imagination in all of you to say, how do we take this criteria forward? Working at the Gates Foundation, I'm interested in a very similar dialogue within the Gates Foundation. It's not terribly hard my point is, it's not terribly hard when you invest large amounts of money to bring about impacts. The far deeper question before you invest is this investment, does it gel with the other interventions in town? Will the impacts of such interventions be sustained after you leave town? I think for the most part, it's not just within the Gates, I think in the international development community, but I'd go further, having spent many years in Canada and the US, I don't think locally too, domestically too, we're doing a serious job of addressing some of these questions. Right. So we're not wasting time. I think this whole idea of this slide really is these are lines literally taken off from OECD's latest documents, where they claim that thinking about such criteria enables the determination of the merit, worth, or significance of an intervention. There's also a claim that it provides a more comprehensive picture of the intervention. I think I'm going to challenge this as we go along. I agree with the comments about comprehensiveness. I think we can do better, and not better in terms of new criteria, but the big issue for me is I'm sold that I'm just delighted that we have a revised version. To be honest, I expected more, but I'm concerned as I hear some of the discussions that these criteria do not stifle our imagination, nor do they lead to mechanical use. But as far as today goes, and I'm not perhaps going to give it the justice it needs because 30 minutes is awfully short, a lot of my thinking is how does the fact that almost every intervention I'm working on in the last few months, there's not a single one that has not had to adapt in some serious way. We've had to rethink our theories of change. We've had to rethink what actually matters. What's the secret sauce of intervention? So the question I'm posing is, what does this mean in the process of how we value itself, the process of valuing itself? So that's part one of my talk. Two is I'm going to change focus, and I'm now going to look at the sustainable development, the sustainable development goals documents and the no one left behind. Just a little bit about myself. For the last decade or so, I've been deeply interested in, a little more than a decade, maybe 15 years, deeply interested in how do interventions actually impact inequities. I find now, as now working in a funding shop, many interventions, you'll see in a lot of documents that say this intervention will impact inequities, etc. Often a theory of change of how on earth it impacts inequities is awfully missing. We're still caught up in averages. But beyond that, the SDG focus on no one left behind. If it's got to move more than a rhetoric, how do we go about it? So here's where it's directly from the SDG documents. This agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. We endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. Let me start by I have yet to see a well-planned intervention that operationalizes these ideas super seriously. I see some attempts at it. Let me start off by saying we can do a better job thinking about how does an intervention plan itself pass the smell test that is serious about no one left behind. Two questions. What is the evaluation community's role? I'm speaking primarily to evaluators here, in ensuring that there is substance to such a claim. It's a claim we can all agree upon. There's a certain warmth in such a claim, but it's upsetting if that's just rhetoric. But I think the second comment is a more deeper comment. I think when you're faced with the complexity of the world, I spend most of my time in theory-driven evaluation. I see John Main on the call. I see Fred Carden. Ray Posson. I spend a lot of time thinking about theory-driven evaluations. My view is when faced with great complexity, most of our theories of change are highly incomplete. We need ways to navigate these interventions towards greater states of completeness. In a way, we need to build knowledge of what to implement as we go along itself. So it was a wonderful document that I absolutely loved. What does it mean to leave no one behind? From you, I want you to think about it. When you talk about no one left behind, we're not just talking about socioeconomic status. We're talking about a lot more. People are left behind because of geography, because of discriminatory practice, and that's a very topical issue right now, because of shocks and fragility. That's again a super topical, given the pandemic, and because of lack of governance, and that's a super topical issue. And there are people who fall in the multiple intersections of these categories. So the question I have, and this question I'm going to be posing increasingly to my partners, is how on earth are our interventions actually paying attention to issues of people who fall in such intersections? More and more, I'm going to be asking questions right at the evaluation proposal stage. I'm not that fussed about measurement. We'll come to that later. But right in your design stage, I started off my career as a civil engineer. And the secret of doing a good bridge was you've got to have a plan that the bridge is going to stand before you actually build it. So right at the early stage itself, how do you know? How does the intervention pass the smell test that the bridge is going to stand? In this case, you're serious about no one left behind. 2, inequities means that some people have a different set of needs than others. Too often, 9 times out of 10, in my view, most interventions are homogeneous. There is very little thought on how on earth are you going to address different people's needs. There's further very limited thought on how will an evaluation system better help understand implementation heterogeneity over time. Third, one of the most exciting developments in evaluation has been the rise of developmental evaluation, which really sort of addresses some of the questions I've been raising, where right up front, you rarely have complete knowledge of how to change the world. How can developmental evaluation help bridge that gap? And again, the fourth is a more conventional role, where we actually measure and study. This is evidence-informed, but evidence-informed and creating spaces in which we are constantly provoking our theoretical imaginations. So, in my view, by looking forward, for me, being serious about no one left behind is, these are the questions I would pose to the field. And this is the question I would actually be analyzing. What is a minimally sufficient description of an intervention that's serious about impacting equities? 2, how will you tell that this intervention, really the first point, is serious about the needs of no one left behind? 3, in the interventions plans, does it respect the heterogeneous needs of people? 4, this is an important question to reflect on. Can an international organization, irrespective of whether it's a UN or a Gates Foundation or an IDRC, can it really address the needs of people, given the challenge of intersectionality? How do we partner to have greater leverage? 5, the actual leverage of an intervention. I'm of the view most interventions don't hit home runs. You can actually move things along a little bit. How do we build partnerships around that? So the issue is not does an intervention work, but how does the intervention connected with a range of different partners make a difference? So that was my second part of the talk. So the first part really sort of lays out the evaluation criteria. The second one says, actually, all the discussion around no one left behind, we need to embrace that, but we need to be tough on it. We need to be asking tougher questions that go well beyond thumbs up or thumbs down, which is what evaluation tends to do. 2 examples of actual real life stories that have influenced my thinking on addressing inequities. And I want to be clear, most of my focus today is really on inequities, and that's what I think a focus on no one left behind means. First was really about 15 years ago when I was in Scotland. And part of what the Scottish government was deeply concerned about was Scotland has among the greatest amounts of health inequities in the world, in Europe anyway, at that time. You could tell how long somebody was expected to live just based on their zip code itself too. So part of what they did was this intervention called Have a Heart Paisley, where the focus was on reductions in health inequalities over time. What they focused on was on reaching the poorest people, in the hope that, so they spent a lot of time in sending letters out and trying to identify and reach the poorest people. Their hope was by reaching the poorest people, they would provide a whole lot of services that I won't go through, in the hope that once people go through such services, this would lead towards improvements in lifestyle, reductions in heart disease risk, and a reduction in health inequalities over time. Notice the logic of this theory. It says, if you reach the poorest of the poor, if you reach folks who are especially disadvantaged, and they come through all these services, this can make an impact on health inequalities. The focus of my story is not the intervention. It's a rather remarkable phone call. The project director, I'm sitting in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is about 2.5 hours away by bus from Paisley. The project director calls me and says, guess what? 6 months into the intervention, we are not getting the poorest of the poor. What should we do? And she says, my recommendation is we need to use some resources to get our REACH strategy right. And looking back 15 years later, even then I think I was wrong, she had absolutely a point. There's no point for an evaluation to come along 2 or 3 years later to say no impacts on health inequalities. What I said was a tremendously, almost borderline unethical point, where I said, no, we've got a research protocol going on where we said we're going to do A, B, C, and D. and we've got to stay the course, which is taking a very traditional research point of view on this. I was wrong, and she was right, because I think you have to adapt as you go along. So this idea that research interests should subsume more adaptive learning as you go along is plainly wrong, and we need a different model of thinking about evaluation itself. So 4 lessons: adaptations matter profoundly. And again, our imaginations of how to bring about changes is pretty limited. Let's not exaggerate. 2, we've got to go well beyond protocols and experiments, and I would argue criteria. As we think about it, we've got to have some sort of dynamic systems that make the change. 3, be ready. Interventions are full of surprises, and it's really this whole notion of adaptation that I've already said. 4th point is the most important point. I think we need a little more humility in the way we go about bringing about change. Let's be a little bit more explicit about our own incompleteness right at the start. 2nd, this is about 4 years ago. I was working as a consultant with the World Health Organization. I was facilitating a dialogue around theories of change. The question posed was, how can the WHO the local office in India, go about re-theorizing, rethinking how their own program of work can impact health inequalities in India? Sounds like a tremendously exciting question. And the way they went about it was they organized a 2 or 3 day meeting. I think it was from a Wednesday to Friday in Delhi, where they had about 100 of their staff from all over India come along. And each group, there were 5 or 6 different groups, each group discussed how they plan to theorize about impacting inequalities. On a Friday afternoon, each of the groups presented their plan on impacting health inequalities in India. Most of the plan had the following structure. It was along the lines of, we will partner with the government of UP, or we'll partner with the central government, etc., and they will do the following. Sounded reasonable, sounded a little ambitious. The end of the presentation, the head of the India office at WHO said a few remarkable things that have stayed with me. And he starts his comments, and I'd read these summary presentations because at the end it doesn't add that much new. But that's not what this man said. He said, I just want you to know, he started his comments by saying, I just want you to know I'm your friend. And being your friend gives me the freedom to be honest with you. And he said, I found every one of the presentations superficial. And here's why. And he tells, I used to be in Africa before, and let me tell you the story I heard in Africa about the elephant and the mice. Turns out the elephant and the mice were good friends, and one day the mice goes up to the elephant and says, do you mind we go for a walk? And the elephant says yes, and so the mice, they start walking, and the mice turns around and says, I'm still a little bored. Can we start running? So they start running, and the mice looks back and he looks at all the dust that's being created. So he turns to the elephant, he says, can you believe the amount of dust we have created? And he kind of stresses the we. And of course, I get the point. The point is, it's rather ambitious for a WHO or a Gates Foundation to simply say, we will partner with the Ministry of Health. You're forgetting who the mice is, who the elephant is. In a country like India, it's unlikely that the WHO by itself can impact health inequalities. So it's vital. As we think about theories of change, I've yet to see a decent theory of change that actually pays attention to the power structures required. I'll see something rather drab around partner with Ministry of Health. I think that doesn't capture the knowledge translation of realities at all. We need to be far more explicit about who the elephant is, who the mice is. We've got to be clear. This question, did WHO impact health inequalities like you can attribute it, seems profoundly silly. You've got to be thinking about partnership structures, etc., and how do we, in a serious sense, represent that, I think, leaves a lot to be desired right now. So part of this is a call out that we need to think about addressing inequities in a fresh way. All right, so we're more than halfway there. Just want to go back to the evaluation criteria. Now that I've set the criteria, talked about no one left behind, talked about 2 stories that I think are meaningful. I'm just going to pick a couple of criteria. I like the focus on coherence. And the idea here is the compatibility of the intervention with other interventions in a country, sector, or village or institution. The focus is both on an internal coherence, which focuses much more on within an organization, within the Gates Foundation, how does nutrition and maternal health synergize? External, how does a Gates Foundation intervention synergize with the external set of interventions happening? I find this exciting, but I see a number of students also on the call. I think there are multiple dissertations to be had, just even operationalizing some of these questions. First is actually trying to locate an intervention in a broader ecology, within a town, within a village, within a larger country or a district, is an awfully hard problem. And I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done. My point being, just by saying we need to focus on coherence, that won't do it. Two, I think we need to have a discussion on how on earth are synergies and interlinkages going to be measured. Three, this is important. What mechanisms actually promote coherence? I don't think coherence will happen by magic. We've got to think about sharp mechanisms that both promote coherence, but there's a deeper issue. How do we move towards issues of shared accountabilities? With my former colleagues at the Evaluation Center, we worry about issues of homelessness in Toronto, and we continue to do that. And what's critical to me is just saying this organization is accountable doesn't make a lot of sense. You've got to think about how do we go about shared accountabilities, etc. Impact, which again is often the bread and butter of evaluators. I am increasingly concerned that just by focusing purely on impacts, we have not paid attention to the bigger problem on, are any of these impacts actually sustainable? There's a lovely friend of mine, Yindra Chekan, who's actually presenting right now, who focuses on issues of sustainable and emerging impacts. The questions I have is, in my own thinking at Gates, I'm really more and more interested in how do we move beyond a preoccupation of impacts towards thinking about sustainability and sustainable impacts up front. Does thinking about sustainable impacts change the kind of interventions we invest in, etc.? The last question is especially important. How do we actually measure the absorptive capacity of the system? There's so much international development stories of folks who invested in huge interventions. As long as the funder was in town, the intervention continued. Once the funder left town, everything disappeared. That's a poor state of affairs, and we've got to think a little bit differently about it. Sustainability, the extent to which the net benefits of the intervention continue or likely to continue. It's a point I've already mentioned, but along with my colleague April Nakayama, we had written about a paper on planning for sustainability last year in the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation. We're updating that and thinking about what does an exit strategy look like. But this fundamental question, how do we decide whether the interventions are sustainable? I think far too often it gets operationalized, I think, in a fairly limited sense. We've signed an MOU with the government, etc. That's a good start, but you've got to go far, far more. I think the larger point I'm trying to provoke is how can we actually incorporate planning for sustainability as part of our theory of change. We're almost there. Another 5 minutes, 7 minutes. All of this takes me to the pandemic, and I think it's an absolutely extraordinary time. But I think I want to come back to thinking about complexity. For me, the pandemic brings into sharp focus some of the issues that provoked us to actually start the Evaluation Center about a decade ago. For me, lessons for me was, number one, this whole business of adaptiveness and nimbleness. How do we create systems in which where most of our pathways of influence suddenly disappear? You cannot go to someone's house, etc. An intervention itself is unable to run. How can there be a backup system that is still able to address the needs of people? How do we think about adaptiveness and nimbleness as part of our evaluation criteria? I'm actually going to go with this intervention, even though it has lesser impacts than intervention two, because it actually has the ability to respond quickly and actually morph and form based on the needs of people. Part of our lesson right now has been to be tremendously humble. I actually don't quite know how things are going to be in Canada or in Delhi in 6 days from now. Two, I think this whole business of thinking of theories of change as somehow static objects, the idea that you can somehow continue with the same old theory of change given such massive change, is profoundly silly for me. How do we start thinking about rethinking our theories of change becomes super important. 3, I'll just focus on Canada, but every one of my comments are equally true about places like India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka. How do we pay attention to the needs of people who fall through the cracks in the system? How do we pay attention to issues of intersectionality? And I'm of the view, most of our theories of change don't start with such a focus. We are much too preoccupied, even thinking theoretically about the average. The 4th is perhaps the subtlest point. In my own life, the whole pandemic has sort of really raised the question, what do I actually need in my life? And I'm really surprised at how little I can get by. I'm providing similar kinds of questions for thinking about interventions. Turns out the evaluation field has a rich literature around the minimal intervention components needed. So I'm interested in sort of asking ourselves as we go forward, how do we focus on the minimal needs to kind of say, actually, this is much more sustainable, etc. So again, I just sort of define adaptiveness. For me, it is how does an intervention actually morph to respond to changes in context? I can give examples if needed. But nimbleness is actually the agility. I'm not interested in long-winded discussions around how do we reduce poverty and all that. I'm interested in people have a problem today, and there's a hunger problem today. How do we provide solutioning that can address that quickly? So for me, this is my jumping off point to really sort of think through and come back to the notion of purposes of evaluation. It's a wonderful slide by Michael Patton, the developer of developmental evaluation. And I'm just sort of, it's a good thing to sort of reflect on. We have different roles as evaluators. Sometimes think of it like, and Michael uses the example of making soup. Sometimes when you taste a soup, you're a spouse tasting your partner's soup, and you're providing some feedback. It needs more salt or pepper. Sometimes you're the restaurant critic, where you go to a restaurant and you taste the soup and you say it's the most awful soup in the world, and next day you write about it in the Times of India. Well, you're providing a judgment. What both of these types of purpose of evaluation have in common is you've tried the soup before. You know what the heck the soup is. There's a thing called the soup already. But very often, given very, very complex problems, the soup itself needs to be developed. We might have a recipe for a soup, but that recipe needs to be adapted to certain specific contexts. And your role as an evaluator is to help promote the making of such soup first. There's an argument, Michael and me have a difference, but I think once the soup is made, you can actually go towards a more summative function. But I raise this because a number of the points I'm making actually focuses back on what is the different purpose of evaluation. How do we move between different purposes is the broader point. Another 4 minutes and I'm done. So all of this is, how do we bring a richer focus on use? And my issue is not, we've got to throw in inequities, etc., but how do we bring a much more non-mechanical application? So OECD itself argues they provide 2 principles, and principle 1 is a more aspirational one. We are all about high quality, useful evaluations. It should be contextualized. And again, it should be based on evaluation questions. For me, as we push forward, as we think about how do we actually promote the applications, I would love it to see more applications of what it means for an evaluation to be contextualized. Actual applications to say, we actually didn't bother about this criteria, or we actually decided to focus on this approach because of this context. We need to be much more richer about that. 2, much of OECD's discussion, but much of the other UN agencies' discussion, I think, doesn't do service to the complexity of interventions. Some interventions are genuinely dynamic and genuinely adaptive based on context. I think we need a richer discussion on the types of complexity, etc., as we go forward. 3, I think it's not sufficient to simply say that they need to be based on evaluation questions. We need better applications. But I want to push this. What role does our own uncertainty? Are there spaces of uncertainty we can create in which my own experience has been, it's not like people are walking around with 15 evaluation questions. You've got to create spaces in which people can reflect on, etc., etc. Principle 2 is the criteria depend on the purpose of evaluation, and they aspired for, it should not be applied mechanistically, which is what my concern is. It is a pretty high likelihood it will be. So for me, my question is really, how do we actually think about these multiple purposes of evaluation, and how do we sort of accommodate a much more developmental focus? You can bring other kinds of focuses. That's enough for me for the time being. And how does one actually make decisions on the trade-offs between different evaluation purposes, etc.? 2 more slides and I'm done. So in summary, from my point of view, and this is my judgment, my own critique of it is really, I think, needs deeper considerations of complexity in all its forms, etc. And the pandemic, more than almost any time in our history, reminds us how little of the world you can actually control. 2, if you're serious about no one left behind, you've got to be serious about what mechanisms work for which people. You've got to think about heterogeneities up front, and we've got to think about distributions of different impacts. We need different kinds of impact for different people right up front. 3, most of how to go about solutioning is not clear. One of evaluation's role is much more developmental. How can evaluation itself help with knowledge translation is an important point. Related to that is the notion of theories of change itself as incomplete knowledge. And how does an evaluation system help us move towards greater completeness? In my view, inequities has not been seriously considered. And how does what are the features of a genuine theory of inequities? I'm unconvinced that our normal thinking around theories of change in any form, in all our guidance documents, has addressed issues of inequity. So this is a comment not just to OECD, etc. It's a comment to the broader field. I don't think we've actually operationalized context, and in some cases, genuine contexts that make people far more likely to be likely to be left behind in a serious way. I think this commented on adaptiveness and nimbleness that I've already made. How do we think about solutioning that actually promotes adaptiveness? I think going back to the fact that we are actually living in a time in which we realize we don't actually have as much control as we think. How do we provide adaptive solutions? How do we ensure that such solutions are nimble? Last slide. So in my view, in my sort of desire for the future, this is my agenda. How do we think about what's the theory of inequities? How do we take, what's the theory of change that takes inequities super seriously? 2, let's actually have a deeper dialogue than simply listing all the different purposes of evaluation. 3, how do we become serious about sustainability right up front? I think it's a profound mistake to worry about sustainability 2 months before the funding runs out, which is often the state of affairs. 4, it's not simply enough to say this intervention works. You've got to ask deeper questions around what is it about the intervention that works? Actually asking questions around mechanisms and asking, are those mechanisms actually scalable? I don't think there's been enough discussion around that. 5, changing problems of inequities. The problems didn't take 1 year to get bad. They've been a result of hundreds of years of neglect. I think we need a richer discussion around both timelines and trajectories. You cannot make statements about impacts. You've not thought up front about how long would this take. Michael Woolcock had a fantastic paper about a decade ago on that. 6, I think we've got to move away from a fixation on just our intervention. We've got to be constantly asking ourselves what else is needed to make a difference, and how do we build in such synergies, etc. Going back to discussions around coherence. 7, not enough to say programs work. Asking deeper questions around distributions of impacts and how do we learn better, both about needs of intersections and how we plan to do about it. What we plan to do becomes important. When you do that, we learn a little bit more about what program actually mechanisms work for the most disadvantaged. So finally, coming back to the top, learning from the pandemic, how do we actually encourage, what are learning systems that promote interventions that can be modified to be nimble and adaptive? You've got to respond to the problem, not stay stuck to the script itself too. And what are we learning as our interventions? My work in India focuses on nutrition and maternal health. The work with colleagues in Toronto focuses more on homelessness, about what are the system level implications, what are system level support structures needed. Let me stop here. On to you, Winnie.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's impressive presentations. So we received many questions here. It's around. So I think I will read the first 5 questions. So the first one is from Rasmi. So what strategy should be followed to reach to the left outs? And then the next question is on TOR, should indicate to follow principle of no one left behind. What are your views on this? Should I read all of the question and then you respond?
Can you read probably 3 or 4 at a time? And that's my capacity, my absorptive capacity.
All right. The next question is from Sudartipan. Many of intervention in practical don't have enough time for proper analysis of theory of change before starting the activities. So in such case, how we can consider the no one left behind concept? So this is the first 3 questions.
Okay, let me take a stab at all 3 first. First, I think, just to be very clear, where I'm not really, despite my rather grand tone, I think what I'm stating is quite achievable. Is I think we need to have a deeper dialogue around bringing a focus on issues around no one left behind, even in these objects, that these methods called theories of change, realist evaluation, etc. As some of you know, a lot of my summer has been spent talking to folks like Ray Posson. John Main is going to join a dialogue in a week from now, and Fred maybe in a few weeks from now, around where is the evaluation field itself missing. So my own immediate focus is how do we improve our own furniture, our own instruments. I think our methods are a little bit too focused on the average for my taste. So that's my most immediate focus itself too. But I think there are a number of other points I've raised here itself too. We're bringing beyond, so before the investments are made, actually funders, whether it's the government, whether it's development funders, whether it's any kind of funder, actually has to sort of say, what's a good enough theory of change that can be implemented? It's a deep point. As an evaluation community, we've spent probably, there have been about 200,000 articles written on what's the best design for an evaluation. There have been like 4 articles written on what's a good enough theory of change. That's a problem, because we are making investments for theories of change that really, the bridge will not stand. And I think we need to address that balance. That's my first, that's 1. 2, in terms of reference, I think it's a very deep question. And now that I work as a funder, and I think different funders have different kinds of flexibilities, I think the role of commissioners is important in moving away from pretending that we have far greater knowledge about the world. I like it when we have a much more adaptive, where we get to know our partners, where we actually sort of don't start right away from the proposal. It's a very different model of commissioning. So I think it's not just the terms of reference, which often, so I think there's much discussion to be had around how do we improve our terms of reference. But I think we've got to think about commissioning itself as a much more dynamic process. My second point too is I would increasingly think of investments in a multiple phase process, where often we make judgments up front. Here is $40 million or $400,000 right up front for a large investment. I think we should actually have a phase 1 in which we actually understand that that the different teams are paying attention to these multiple issues before we go much, much further. The third point around not having time, etc. I think it's a very fair point. But again, I think that the problem, I think, this is where the onus, I feel, folks like me, folks like others have a role to play, is we need to have a broader dialogue around, actually, this is why the smell, if this theory of change does not pass the smell test, I don't think we should go towards implementation, etc. We need a far more sharper dialogue along that. We've missed that as of now. Okay, those are my quick answers. Take it forward. Go ahead. Omi, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And then the next question is from Fred Carden. Evaluation is still often separate from programs. How does it become more integrated? If we are going to address inequalities, isn't it too late if evaluation comes into the picture when the programming has been designed and funded? And then the next question is from Nidhi Sarma, Malaysia. There are complex aspects of development as well as pandemic implication, which we can really measure or envisage. So speaking from a critical realist standpoint, how do we create a space for the unknown and deepen the inquiry? And then from Sadhu Babu, in this pandemic, household survey is a challenge. How can we use a web pulse method? In this case, we may miss the confidence intervals. So what is your view here, please?
Can you repeat the last question? I actually didn't quite fully understand. Can you repeat the last question?
So It's pointing out about the situation with the pandemic. How can you advise on the possibility to have a household survey, because it
Oh, I
is
see.
quite challenging? How about the internet using an online protocols like or also another option like web polls? So what would you say about this kind of
Great.
survey?
Okay, fantastic. I get it. I like where Fred is going, though I disagree that it's ever too late. I think the whole idea here is to sort of bring sort of evaluated thinking up front. I think the richer point for me, where Fred's point takes me to, and is something I'm deeply committed to, is I think if evaluations are genuinely successful, the evaluative thinking has to happen within the program itself. I think there's a role for external evaluation in some circumstances, but in a majority of cases, I think we need to move towards an evaluation culture in which the program implementation organization, whether it's an evaluator or the implementer itself, really is building his or her evaluative skills. A lot of when I was at the evaluation center, and even the webinars they're organizing now, really targets implementers, not just a class of people called evaluators. And I think that's vital. I like Fred's question too, because it also suggests what roles does the evaluation play, etc., if at the early stages is much more developmental. But I think it's sort of irrelevant to me, whether the evaluator is external or internal. The important part is how do we actually move towards, actually, in a sense, Fred's question is connected to Nidhi's question. How do we create spaces in which uncertainty and there's a recognition of I don't quite know what to do about it? I've found such challenges happening within internal teams itself too. So for me, if you crack Nidhi's question, I think you move us towards a stage in which even Fred's question can be answered. So for me, Nidhi, in terms of your question itself too, I can tell you what I do. I don't have any grand answers. When I'm presented with any theories of change, my first question to the implementer, who's supposed to sort of be excited about this theory of change, is tell me, and then I'll ask very precise versions of this question, but tell me what are areas you're really uncertain about in terms of implementation. What are some contexts that are needed? What are some support structures that are needed for the intervention to work, et cetera, et cetera. And actually creating spaces in which funders themselves are encouraging a language of uncertainty is quite important. But creating such spaces requires sort of relationship building. No one's going to tell you on day one here, because the whole drama is around, look how cool I am, look how learned I am, and then coming along and talking about uncertainty is not going to happen. So creating that space in which this is what matters becomes quite important. So I've actually found people sort of being remarkably responsive to that. But I think the onus for us is really creating those kinds of spaces. Just 2 weeks ago, the Evaluation Center had Ray Posson talking about realism and talking about different contexts during the time of the pandemic. And what was wonderful about what the Evaluation Center did was they had folks who run a homeless shelter kind of really challenge Ray on actually these are our different contexts, etc. There are folks who run a program called Dancing with Parkinson's that provides, in the past, would provide dance classes. Now it's providing things on Zoom class. There are a whole bunch of uncertainties around that. I think it promoted that sort of dialogue. I think Sudesh Babu's question, a fair one. I think there are multiple implications of it. I'm deeply interested. It's not something I'm the hottest person to answer that, but I've really begun thinking about what are different online data platforms, both of a qualitative and a quantitative nature, that can help access this kind of information. I do want to start with a more ethical response that I have felt at this time of the pandemic, I've actually wanted some of the evaluation teams to back off as people are adapting. I cannot say getting a response to our survey is the most important thing. Finding the time has been the most important thing. But actually thinking about rich online data platforms that will help us provide this information. Once again, let me plug an evaluation center workshop from on Thursday, where they have folks from the UN, from UNDP, talking about applications of WhatsApp use in understanding crime situations in Afghanistan. Then there's another person who's talking about nutrition in India, the use of smartphones, etc. So there are other kinds of technologies. So that's why I do embrace the new brave world. But it's important we don't reify, we don't move away from a focus on individual stories as we get at this. It should not be a checklist approach to information where I'm cooler than you because I got 10,000 surveys and you got only 100. That's silly. I think ensuring we're actually listening to people's voices and no one left behind, actually creating spaces in which we hear people's voices becomes important. So again, even in our answering your questions, Suresh Babu, paying attention to, are we getting the data from the folks who actually have a story to tell becomes important. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. The next question is from Erwin, Indonesia. How evaluation in detail can build a coherence thing, as you mentioned, for all the countries, considering the level of capabilities and challenges would be different. So this is related with the equity as focus of SDGs, no one left behind. And then the next question is from Merwin, Philippines. Can you please provide a specific example applying the concept of adaptiveness and nimbleness of an intervention or set of intervention? I also have one question here regarding this. So to what extent do you think the proposed method to accelerate adaptations? Because lately I use a lot theory of recent action, which is widely known in public health. So perhaps you can explore on that. And then the next question is from Sam Gerstein. Several moments ago, you had mentioned an effort's secret sauce. Do you feel that if intervention team focus more on articulating their secret sauce, they would naturally trend towards discussion of inequity? Yeah.
So I think one sort of general comment, a lot of what I'm raising are questions around why as a field we got to ask tough questions, ask super uncomfortable questions, and I'm not, while I'm going to engage with every one of these questions, I want to be blunt and be humble about saying I don't think I've got the answers for it. I just think that's what I'm just delighted to talk to, as I see almost 111 people on the line right now. So that's what excites me. The first question, I think, is Irvin. I don't have deep answers on coherence at all. I think I don't have a clear approach. I'm actually saying I've worked in multiple settings, including the US, Canada, UK. I am unconvinced that anyone is ahead of the game on answering that question. All of the power plays that come with commissioners of evaluation, etc., often sort of being lone rangers, etc., are equally true everywhere. So questions of coherence, I think, is an open issue. I don't have a great answer, but actually kind of going through a process, asking questions around, is this intervention coherent, etc. The deeper point is what I've already made for the coherence part. How do we go about thinking about issues of shared accountabilities for solving problems? I go back to some of the evaluations my team in the evaluation center a few years ago and me had done around homelessness in Toronto, in some of the poorest parts of Toronto. But the question from the province and the city was really questions around accountability for this one organization we were evaluating. It became painfully obvious that was exactly the wrong question. The question we needed to precipitate was what would be a system of shared accountabilities that would promote a more coherent set of actions. And for the most part, while we raised these issues, we didn't move things forward as much as we could. I don't say that with any apology or embarrassment, but I think it's a need that we need to take this forward. At the end, I'm not looking for examples of how OECD measures coherence, how UNDP measures coherence. I think we need examples of actual applications on the ground that have led towards more coherent interventions. So I'm just calling that out. Two, I think in terms of examples, and I think Mervyn is like, be specific is what I hear him say. A lot of our discussions and with that my colleagues in the evaluation center have been raising with the homelessness project are really trying to study, trying to put some measurement around in what ways was this organization, it was Margaret's Community Housing, In what ways were they adaptive? In what ways were they nimble, and for whom? They're trying to answer that question. No sophisticated measurement over here, but I think we're trying to arrive at that. In a similar way, in my work with the Gates Foundation, working in UP, a couple of you are part of such a discussion, working with us in UP. We are really trying to understand how were the platforms that were created to address problems of maternal health and nutrition, how were they leveraged, how were they useful for addressing issues emerging from COVID-19? Was there a stronger system along those lines, etc.? I think the third question, and again, a lot of this focus on secret sauce and active ingredients really come out from a more realist thinking about what's the nature of program mechanisms. Sadly, the answer is no. Just because you know what the secret sauce of an intervention is, doesn't mean you're actually serious about inequities. Because you might get so caught up, as often we do, to say, actually, it's about this is the key mechanism. But you constantly got to ask yourself, is this mechanism going to work differently for those who fall under multiple intersections as compared to the average? So the secret sauce can still promote fairly homogeneous thinking. So you need to be bringing in deeper thinking around intersections, etc. Back to you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. So the next question is from Makati Maxiabi. So what plans are being put in place during planning stages of a program to ensure good coverage by design of the program itself and not its evaluation only? The second is from Isa Miranda. How do contextual no one left behind time of interventions? Is it different to time of evaluations? And then the next one is from Adeola. How do donor agencies preclude evaluation as part of project or program from inceptions? Can I take the last one from Cindy Nambiat? So going beyond protocol, how many funders and how many partners are open to flexibility?
All right. Let's start with the last one. I think the whole idea of these kinds of dialogues is to build a community. I'm not the least bit fussed. If the answer is 1% or 99%, either way, I'm not bothered. The bigger challenge is how do we build a dialogue that changes certain cultures in multiple organizations, including with multiple funders, that leads us towards some of the things we've talked about today. So the question becomes, what do we do as a community that stops just complaining about the problem towards actually creating a culture in which the funders themselves lead towards more progressive models of commissioning? So many years ago, almost 15 years ago, when I was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and we organized a summer school, the most successful summer school would focus for one day on funders and what does thinking about complexity mean. And we found it really remarkable because the funders really loved it, and they would often, do things differently. I think we need to do more of that itself too. I think I'm moving backwards, and I think Adeola's questions around inception stage. I think, and I can just speak to myself, right, speak to my own efforts, what I'm trying to bring within my own organization is greater clarity around actually we need folks who provide this is our grand proposal for implementing ideas 1, 2, 3, and 4. We need greater sharpness of questions that will allow us to tell this person actually has thought through about the theory of change quite deeply. That for me also means that you actually understand the context in which this intervention is going to be implemented. Very often, what we have is a very evidence-based narrative that people talk about. There's a rich evidence for this intervention, blah, 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 without focusing on the actual context. So for me, part of what I'd like to do is promote a deeper language around context that we say, actually, this is proof. This person actually knows that I can hear some feedback here. I can hear a lot of people. I'm moving backwards again. For me, and again, there's time to discuss more on this will be in context of this event and context of evaluation. Either way, I'm not fussed. I think we need a richer discussion around context. I think the first question, I think Malkori's point around planning. I think a lot of my focus really has been how do we as an evaluation community think in a richer way about promoting more evaluative thinking right at the planning stage itself, especially when the program architectures itself have to be complex. How do we promote that? So let me stop it there. Umi?
Sorry, my signal was breaking. So,
No
okay,
worries.
thank you, Sanjeev. So I think we need to wrap up now because of the time. But any questions you can raise, and then we can send a written response perhaps later. Okay, thank you so much, Sanjeev, for a great presentation and also discussions. And also thank you to all participants for the questions. And next, we will have closing remarks from our colleague from Sri Lanka Evaluation Association, Randika Demel. He is the core group member of the EvalYouth Asia and also an independent evaluation consultant. So the floor is yours, Randika, please.
Thank you, Umi. On behalf of sleva, EvalYouth, Indonesian Development Evaluation Community, Evaluation Community of India, APEA, and Center for Evaluation, for a very engaging and relevant presentation during this COVID-19 pandemic. Further, we would like to thank our moderator for this webinar, Ms. Umi Hanik from the Indonesian Development Evaluation Community. Additionally, we would like to also thank Ms. Rashmi Agrawal for giving the opening remarks from Evaluation Community of India. And also, we would like to thank Ms. Anna Erika from EvalYouth for providing the platform for this webinar. Finally, I would like to thank all the participants from around the world that took part in this webinar. We had over 115 participants, and thank you also for the participants for asking very insightful questions.
Thank you, Randika, for great closing remarks. And then the next one, we will have another event, the APEA Regional Virtual Consultation. Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, the next slide, please. So we will have APEA Regional Virtual Consultation tomorrow, 5:30 or 5:30 Indian time or 7 p.m. Jakarta time. So we would like to invite you all to participate in the regional virtual consultation. It would be great if you can come and join with us. It will be a new opportunity to have an online group discussion with 30 facilitators from all over the world, and also facilitating the discussion happening for the EVAL for action in the region of Asia Pacific. So lastly, we would like to invite you all to join the EVAL for Action campaign. This one is quite important to achieve the sustainable development. This is also relevant with our discussion today. So we also want to invite you to join and also to commit for the influential evaluation. So if you want to learn more about EVAL for Action campaign, please please explore to the website www.evalforaction.org. This event is co-chaired by UNFPA EVAL and EvalYouth, and also the Global Parliamentarian Forum. So lastly, thank you so much for attending this webinar. Also, I would like to thank to Sanjeev for the great presentation. Also to Sri Lanka Evaluation Association, and also the evaluation community of India. So let's continue this cooperation and learning in evaluations. This is a great opportunity to advance our evaluation in development. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Good morning to you, Sanjeev.
Thanks. Thanks so much. This was great fun.
Yeah.
To be continued. Bye-bye.
To be continued. Yeah. See you on the next Sleva webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.